So today we're going to be talking about mindsets for student success and how we think about ourselves, how we think about our students, and some quick overview of the objectives that I have for us today is that we are going to, first of all, we're going to learn about fixed and growth mindsets and compare them so that we can really understand what they are and how they affect us and how they affect our students. Then we're going to analyze the effects of growth mindset-based feedback on our student performance. Then we're going to switch to a different topic, but still closely related, and we're going to talk about asset-based thinking versus deficit-based thinking. And we're going to practice reframing how we can approach students. Sometimes we might call them the difficult students or the students we don't understand why they're acting the way that they're acting, how we can approach them with an asset-based mindset that better supports their success. And at the end of the day, I want to set us up so that we're actually creating a plan to implement the strategies that we're going to talk about today. So to get us started, kind of get our brains a little warmed up on this topic, I want us to reflect on our motivation. And so I've got a few questions here on the screen, and I want you to think about them, share some examples in the chat box, and you all feel free to have as much conversation around your table as you are comfortable and makes sense. And so my questions for you are, what activities are you successful at and that you enjoy doing? And then why do you enjoy doing them? The second question is, what tasks do you perform but consider to not be enjoyable, difficult, or demotivating, or you don't feel like you're good at it? And what strategies do you use to complete those tasks? And this really, like, laundry doesn't count here, right? Like, nobody likes to do dishes or laundry. But these other kinds of tasks that you have to do in your life that you don't like, maybe you don't think that you're good at. And then finally, give me some examples of something that you've learned to do as an adult. So spin on these questions for a minute, drop some of those stories in the chat box, and then talk at least in pairs or around the table in your room. All right, so Susan adds that she enjoys cooking and gardening, that you like to grow your own food for the health factor and the sense of accomplishment. So Susan, let me ask you a question, and I love it if you'll raise your hand, or let's see, maybe I can give you the audio, or whoever has the mic, let me know. But I'd love to hear about, how did you learn to cook? And then how did you learn how to garden? So if you'll at least talk in your group so that they all hear it, I would imagine, Susan, that what you did is that, that you probably were not born out of your mother's womb cooking and gardening, right? Like, you practice, you learned how to do it. One of the things that I think is really interesting about gardening specifically and how it ties into growth mindset is the saying, oh, you have a green thumb, right? And so when someone says, oh, you have a green thumb, it sort of indicates that there's like some sort of genetic thing that you were born with that allows you to grow plants, right? And so I also like to grow and garden. And so I have like a jungle around me in my house, and I have a huge garden, patio garden outside. And so my neighbors are always like, oh, you've got a green thumb. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? I worked really hard to learn how to do this, and I've killed a lot of plants over the years, right? But you have this mindset that I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to figure out how to grow these things, right? And so this is how it is with so many of our tasks that we do. We get motivated to try something, and we either keep trying it or we don't. And maybe you have tried lots of different tasks or been intimidated to start tasks because you think, you know, that's not really for me. I don't think I'm going to be good at it. And maybe you worry about how you look in the process. So keep thinking of those things, and then we'll connect the dots here as we go. So what I have for us now is a little bit of a quiz, and this is from Carol Dweck's work. And so she offers us 6 questions to help us realize what kind of mindset that we have. And so I'm going to start a few polls here, and I'd love to get your responses. Nobody's going to see what you select, but you can still tell us what you think. And so it's just an agree or disagree statement. We're going to do this for all 6. So do a quick response to this. Your intelligence is something very basic about you that you can't change very much. either use the poll or write down on your notebook what you think. All right, so we've got 100% disagree with this statement. All right, now let's go to the next one. So the next poll is you can learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are. Okay, and the next one is no matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it significantly. We've got a little bit of variability on this one. The first one was some variability, all right? The fourth one, you are a certain kind of person and there's not much that can be done to change that. You are a certain kind of person and there's not much that can be done to change that. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree with the statement? All right, so we've got that one done. Let's look at the next one now. So the next one is the fifth one. No matter what kind of person you are, you can always change substantially. So what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with the statement? No matter what kind of person you are, you can always change substantially. So the last poll that we're going to look at is the sixth one. And the sixth one says you can do things differently, but the important parts of who you are can't be changed. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? Ooh, we've got an even split here. Okay. So you can do things differently, but the important parts of who you are can't be changed. So we're like 50-50 split in your room today. So let's keep a note of that and then come back. Okay. So let's look at what fixed and growth mindset are. So again, this comes from Dr. Carol Dweck out of Stanford. She's been doing this work for probably 20-something years, 20, 25 years. And it has really grown to be a really popular way of looking at how we function and the psychology of success, really. So the first is the fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is a belief that your intelligence, your personality, and your ability are static. Nothing can be done to change that. And the second thing that we're going to focus on today, more importantly, is a growth mindset, which is a belief that your intelligence, your personality, and your ability can be developed and improved with practice. And so we're going to come back to these definitions and break them down and understand what the characteristics are. So the key characteristics of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset is one, as I just said, is that intelligence, your ability, they're static, whereas the growth always thinks that you can develop it. A fixed mindset person is always focused on looking smart, whereas a growth mindset person is focused on learning. A fixed mindset person is afraid to make mistakes, so they avoid them, and they do everything that they can to avoid them in many cases, whereas a growth mindset person is really comfortable making mistakes, and they'll take the risk because they think that they can learn from that mistake rather than focus on, I've got to be the best at this, so I'm not going to try, so because it might mess up your image. The next characteristic is that a fixed mindset avoids challenges and gives up, whereas a growth mindset person embraces challenges and persists in spite of those challenges. Next, a fixed mindset person ignores feedback, right? This is very common to like externalizing, having like an external attribution. So when someone gives you feedback that you maybe don't like, if you have a fixed mindset, you think, you know what, that's ridiculous. I don't know where that's coming from. They just don't like me. They're out to get me. This feedback is nonsense. Secretly raise your hand if you've ever had that kind of response to feedback. I think we all have in some form or another. Whereas a growth mindset person can take the feedback and can learn from it. And so, you know, we can have a whole conversation about feedback specifically. And so how feedback often tells us a little bit about the person than the other person than it does about us. But there's always something that we can take from the feedback and learn from it. And the final characteristic of a fixed versus a growth mindset is that a fixed mindset person feels threatened by others' success, whereas a growth mindset person is inspired by the success of others. And what's unique about fixed and growth mindset is you can have a fixed and growth mindset about different things. So I might have a growth mindset and my ability to become an engineer, but I might have a fixed mindset and my ability to become a golf champion, right? And so it's generally task-based or sort of, area focused, right? Like you could have a growth mindset about some sports and the fixed mindset about other sports, which is the case in my brain. And so again, it's always task-based. Now, let's look and see what these statements are. So based on what you just learned about the key characteristics, what kind of statement do you think that the first statement is? Your intelligence is something very basic about you that you can't change very much. If you agreed with that statement, do you think it's a fixed or a growth mindset statement? So just around the table, do a quick vote. So if you agreed with that statement, then that suggests a fixed mindset. Whereas if you disagreed with that statement, it's a growth mindset. The second one, again, go around the table and do a quick, shout out to what you think this is, a fixed or growth mindset statement. So it is, you can learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are. So that is also a fixed mindset statement. And the last question for this set, the first three are specifically around intelligence. The second three are around personality. And so the third one here is no matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it significantly. So if you agreed with that statement, that signals that you have a growth mindset. Let's look at the second set. You are a certain kind of person and there is not much that can be done to change that. Is that a fixed or a growth? Go around the table, quick shout out. That is a fixed mindset statement. Number 5, no matter what kind of person you are, you can always change substantially. Oops, I got ahead of myself. Number 6, you can do things differently, but the important parts of who you are can't be changed. That's a fixed mindset statement. And what's interesting is you all in your group are about 50-50 split on that. So that can make for a really good conversation and follow up to our time together today. And then number 5, we'll jump back to that one. So no matter what kind of person you are, you can always change substantially. That is a growth mindset statement. All right, so I want to give you a chance to reflect on this, and I want you to either discuss in pairs or discuss in small groups, but try to avoid discussing in the big group because then everyone will get a chance to share. But my questions for you here are, what kind of mindset do you have based on these 6 statements? Were you surprised by the findings? Does your mindset and the associated behaviors help you succeed in learning or work against you? And then think about, when have you had a fixed mindset about yourself and it kept you from doing something you were interested in doing? When have you had a growth mindset and it motivated you to do something new? When have you had a fixed mindset about a student and it kept you from supporting them in a more positive way? So spend a few minutes reflecting. Give me some feedback in the chat box so I can hear from you and so I can build on your stories and anecdotes, and then make sure that you're talking around the table there, at least in pairs. Steve, thanks for starting us off. So you admitted that you've got a very growth mindset in some things, but have a more fixed mindset in others. And you're not alone. One of the things that I love about this theory, the fixed and growth mindset theory, is it's one of the easiest things that we can change. When I read the book first when I was, I don't know, probably about 7 years ago, and I had no idea the extent that I had fixed mindsets about many things in my life. So let me give you an example. When I was in high school, I competed in powerlifting. I still competed in powerlifting up until a few years ago, until I broke my back. But I competed in powerlifting for a really long time. And when I was in high school, I won state and nationals. And I knew that I won state and nationals, not because I was like gifted as a strong person, but because I worked really hard, right? Like I trained 6 days a week, 2 to 3 hours a night. But then I had an injury my senior year, and I thought, I'm gonna go play golf. And so I walked out onto the golf practice, range, and I thought, I'm going to be great at this, right? Because I'm a national champion athlete. Of course, this is something for me. And guess what? I was terrible. I mean, really, really terrible. And I'm ashamed to say that like probably after 5 practices, I quit. And in hindsight, it's hilarious to me that I had such a fixed mindset about that when I knew as a strength athlete, I had such a growth mindset, right? But there was something that didn't translate in my brain to say, like, you have succeeded in this because you worked really hard. So of course you're not just going to walk onto the field and be excellent at this. And so this happens in many things in our lives, right? So we could have really beautiful growth mindsets to try new things, but then in something very similar or something that we might correlate as being related to it, we can have a really fixed mindset. Morris, thanks for adding that you try to embrace all meaningful change, realize it is grow or die. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And I think that it's something that many of us may not have been raised to have that mindset. And that's something that we can learn and grow into because we have growth mindsets in our lives. So I want you to keep thinking about this, and I'm going to send these questions to you all as after our time together today so that you can continue to think about them and hopefully continue to have some rich discussion on them. So let's look at what's next. So I'm going to read you some scenarios, and I want you to use the poll to tell us if you think that this scenario, if this person has a fixed or growth mindset. Okay. I'm going to get that published. Okay, listen to here. So the student, this is a student, his name's Dylan. Dylan recently graduated from high school and is now struggling as a math student in a local community college. In middle school, a teacher told him that he wasn't good at math and shouldn't go into a math-related career. He struggled in math through middle and high school and now doesn't feel comfortable asking his teacher or peers for help. Lately, Dylan has been absent from his math classes, even though they are required for his degree in health and human services. So use the poll. Does Dylan have a fixed or growth mindset? And in the chat box, I want you to, using those characteristics of fixed or growth mindset, explain why. All right, let's hear why you think Dylan has a fixed mindset in the chat box. So he graduated from high school. He's struggling with math in community college. He had a middle school teacher who told him he wasn't good at math, shouldn't go into math career. So he struggled through math. And now he's skipping math classes. He's not asking for help. And he's just avoiding it. Yeah, so Dylan, Brett says that Dylan doesn't think his intelligence in math can change. He's let someone else define who and what he can be. Doesn't feel like he can concede. You know, this one usually hits home with a lot of people. How many of you have had someone in your life that either directly said or suggested that you're not good at math? We've yet to figure out why, but for some reason, you know, there's this cultural norm where people say, oh, I don't do math. I'm not a math person, right? But people don't say, oh, I can't read. I'm not a reading person. They might say openly admit they don't read books, but people don't have a pride in saying, I can't read, right? But they do have a pride in almost saying, oh, math, that's not for me. I know in my household growing up, it was very much anytime math problems came along, my mom just like pointed to my dad and said, don't do math, go ask your dad. And even though she didn't ever say women can't do math, it was an implicit suggestion that women don't do math, especially when all my friends' moms did the very same similar things, right? And so fortunately, my dad helped me to develop a growth mindset in math because I knew that if I worked, I would get better at it. But what's interesting so often about math and along the continuum of your students is that you could have a growth mindset and that you know that if you do work, you're going to get better at it. But yet you still have a real external focus on looking smart, right? So maybe we don't highlight that we worked hard. So maybe you have a student or maybe yourself. You're in an instance where someone says, oh, wow, like you did a great job on this. And then you just sort of flip it off and be like, oh yeah, it wasn't anything. But yet you worked really, really hard and spent a ton of hours on it because we want to make things look easy. Well, I'm here to tell you folks that doesn't serve our students when we make everything look easy, right? It better serves them to talk about how much we worked and how much we struggled and how much we failed before we got to the point where we were trying to succeed. So we've got a couple of responses. Morris add, he should realize that he has to have the classes. He has to overcome his own feelings. Yeah. He already has his own mind made up about his ability. Right. So one of the things that as a teacher that we could do to help Dylan is if he's in our class, we can help Dylan understand that 1, math is not a genetic thing. That 2, with effort, he can improve. And 3, to always ask for help. And if he's not asking for help because there's something that is a barrier for him, what is it that we can do to eliminate that barrier? And so for students who are struggling, it's really easy to say, oh, they're just not working hard. They just don't want this. But because we care about serving our students and we care about helping them be successful, sometimes it takes an extra conversation. It takes an extra effort to look at that student and talk to them and say, hey, why aren't you showing up? Like, I'm here for you. I want to help you. I believe that you can do it. And we're going to talk about how influential that kind of feedback is for students later on. Let's look at another scenario. So this scenario is about Jane. Jane likes middle school, but she also likes socializing with her friends. Many of her friends have been winning the Student of the Week award in science class, which is given to the student who gets the highest grade on the weekly quiz. Jane really wants to win the award too, so she starts going to tutoring sessions with her science teacher. When the new award is announced, Jane gets excited and nervous. Unfortunately, her name isn't called and Jane is disappointed, although she congratulates her classmate who won the award. When she gets home, she looks over her quiz from the week before and corrects the mistakes. The next day, Jane asks her science teacher if she can retake the quiz to see how she improved and make a plan for how to study for the next quiz. So let me turn the poll back on, do a quick poll. So vote again whether you think that whether Jane has a fixed or a growth mindset. And then I want you to add some things into the chat box on why. Why do we know that Jane has a fixed or a growth mindset? What are the specific things that are evidenced in the scenario? So it looks like we have a unanimous vote for growth. That is correct. She does have a growth mindset. And so let's go back to the chat box and tell me why. Yeah, so Teresa said she's willing to learn from her mistakes. She didn't let her mistakes define her. She believed that she could do better and took steps to get there. Yes. And so what are some of the things that as a teacher, the teacher can support the student and these kinds of things? Additional things, she believed she could do better and took steps. Yes, she did not give up after she did not win the award. Another thing here is that she was inspired by her classmates' success, right? So she went up to her classmate and congratulated them. How many of us, if we don't get the award, sometimes aren't always the best sport about it, right? So it doesn't always mean that we're going to have that best mindset. She was proactive and did not stop trying. Jane is looking to learn from feedback. And she seeks it out, right? And so she improves as a result. All right, so you've got it. Let's look at a research study that helps us understand how our praise affects student behavior. Morris added, jumping back here, she said that Morris said that she's definitely in a growth mindset. She keeps on working to overcome the setback. Yes, the teacher can point out how close she came and talk to her about how far she has come and the opportunities she has to grow. Yeah, absolutely. And again, as I suggested earlier, like one of the things I love so much about teaching with the growth mindset is that with really small changes and how we think or how we give feedback, it not only affects our belief and our self-efficacy, which is the belief that we can accomplish a task, but it can affect students' outcomes. And so I want to introduce a research study here that really maps this out very nicely. So in this research study, there was a group of students and they had 3 puzzle challenges. The students didn't know the difficulty of the challenges. They just knew that they had 3 challenges in a row. So the first challenge that they got, the first puzzle, was a moderately challenging puzzle. The second one they got was very challenging, and then the third one was back down to moderately challenging. But again, they didn't know this distinction. All they knew is they did 3 puzzles in a row. Now, the split here is that there was one group of students in one classroom, and they received intelligence-based praise, whereas the group in the other room, they received effort-based praise. So intelligence-based praise is the, oh, wow, you're so smart. Look at you, Harvard bound, versus effort-based praise of, oh, wow, you worked really hard. I can see it's evidenced in your result. So the question is the students were asked, what type of puzzle do you want for the third challenge? And so we're going to look at the results from the students from the different rooms, and you're going to guess. You can just shout out around your table, maybe not shout, but discuss around your table. So the students from the intelligence-based praise versus the students from the effort-based praise group, what types of puzzles do you think that they selected for their third challenge? So the students who were told, you must be very smart throughout all the first two puzzles, what kind of puzzle do you think that they selected for the third challenge versus the effort-based praise? So drum roll, please. The response is the students from the intelligence-based praise, they chose an easier puzzle. Whereas the effort-based praise students, they chose a harder puzzle. And the reason is because of the first group, they avoided the challenges and hard work, even if it provided opportunities to succeed. You could also connect this to the characteristic around focus on looking smart at all costs, right? And so whereas the effort praise students, they were eager to take on challenges because they knew that their effort and persistence would be rewarded in that. Now let's look at the next question. So the next question is, let's look at the data here. So what type of puzzle do you want for the third challenge? I want you to put your estimations in the chat box. So what percent of effort praise students and what percent of intelligence praise students chose to try harder problems after completing the first two tasks? So put some numbers in the chat box or write them down in your notebook or discuss with somebody next to you. So the response is 92% of the effort praise students and 33% of the intelligence praise students chose to try harder problems after completing the task. So what that means is that 9 out of 10 of the students who were in the room they were told, hey, your hard work matters, they wanted to try harder problems. There were still 8% of them that didn't want to try the harder problems. Now, in the intelligence praise room, those students, a third of them did want to try harder problems, but 2/3 of them didn't, right? So again, there's a really big difference on the kind of challenge that the students want to take on. And we certainly know that more challenging tasks help us to learn more. So we want to give feedback to our students so that they want to choose to take on more difficult challenges. Now, the next question is do you want to compare scores or do you want to learn new strategies? Now let's look at the two groups. The intelligence-based praise group versus the effort-based praise group. What do you think that they wanted? Did they want to compare scores or learn new strategies? You can add them in the chat box or discuss in your groups. And the response is the intelligence praise students, they wanted to know how did everyone else do? Whereas the effort praise students, they wanted new strategies to solve the puzzles. And relating this back to the characteristics of fixed and growth mindset, again, the intelligence praise students, they were so focused on looking intelligent that they didn't want to learn anymore. They just wanted to see how did everyone else do. Whereas the students who've been told, hey, you're working hard, I can see the evidence of what you've accomplished, they didn't care how everyone else did. They wanted more strategies so that they could learn more things. Again, this is what we want from our students, right? So let's look at the numbers here. Again, the question is, do you want to compare scores or learn new strategies? So put in the chat box, what percent of effort praise students and what percent of intelligence praise students chose to receive feedback instead of seeing other students' scores? So what do you think the split is here? 77% of effort praise students and 14% of intelligence praise students chose to receive feedback. So again, 3/4 of the effort praise students and only 14% of the intelligence praise students wanted feedback. Again, this is really a really big delta between these two. And so if we want to encourage our students to accept our feedback, we can learn to give them feedback so that they learn that, that by asking for feedback, it helps them learn more. All right, one last question. So now let's look at how did they actually do? So we looked at what's their mindset, and now we want to look at how did they actually perform. So let's look at this. The question I want to pose to you now is, put it in the chat box if you can. The intelligence-based praise students, how well do you think they did? Now remember, it was a moderately challenging, very challenging, and then back to moderately challenging. So on the third challenge, do you think that they did better or worse than they did on the very challenging test? So again, moderately challenging, very challenging, back to moderately challenging. They don't know that. Did the intelligence-based praise students do better or worse? And did the effort-based praise students do better or worse? Yes, Morris, you're right. So the intelligence students, not the intelligence students, the intelligence-based praise students, they saw a decline in their performance, whereas the effort-based praise students saw an improvement in their performance. And again, this connects to the characteristics. This suggests that the intelligence-based praise students are more likely to give up when facing obstacles, whereas the effort-based praise students persist in spite of those obstacles and faces them courageously. So let's look at the numbers here. The effort praise students improved their score on their final challenge by nearly what percent, while the intelligence praise students decreased their score by nearly what percent? So we're looking at up and down. So what percent did the effort praise students do better, and what percent change did the intelligence praise students receive on the third test? What do you think? It's an even split. So the split is that the effort praise students did 20% better, and the intelligence praise students did 20% worse. So now we've got a 40% delta, right? Which is, again, a really big, potential assessment on student success in general, not just puzzles, right? But the effort praise students did better. And again, it was a moderately challenging. So it wasn't as challenging as the second test. And then the intelligence praise students did worse. So the takeaway here is that in a simple interaction, right? Like in an hour class period, we can give feedback to our students in a different way that immediately affects their results. And it's just changing how we give feedback. It's changing words so that we're praising the effort, we're acknowledging the process. We are helping them to understand that failure is okay. Not failure in the sense that please go make F's in all your classes. That's not what we're trying to encourage them to do. We want them to see that when you fail, what can you learn from that? What's the feedback that you can gain from that? How can you reflect on that and use that to motivate you to move forward? The next key thing I want us to talk about is how students from marginalized populations are more likely to persist and succeed if they have a strong growth mindset. And I want to give you a few examples. So the first is specifically women in STEM. So the research tells us that when women have a growth mindset in STEM, they're more likely to follow a STEM career path. This is something that's really near and dear to my heart because I am an engineer and a computer scientist. And so I know what it's like to be the only woman in a boardroom. I used to work in industry for Texas Instruments, working on MEMS technologies. And I think that I had amazing teachers that gave me feedback along the way that helped me to build a growth mindset. And so this is what we're really aiming to do. And why it matters is particularly in engineering and computer science and the hard sciences like physics and whatnot, women are incredibly underrepresented. It varies across those disciplines, but on average, they are anywhere from, probably average 15 to 20% in those different kinds of pathways. And so we want to help women develop this growth mindset so they have access to those careers. And those careers are awesome options because one, they are really rewarding, and two, they're really high paying. And if half of our population doesn't see access to these, then we have a problem. And so we want to help them build those growth mindset. Next, studies have shown that when African American students are given wise feedback, and I'm going to tell you what that is in a minute, and using growth mindset instruction, that they have greater improvements on their written essays, they have increased academic achievement, and they like class more, right? To me, this is one of the greatest takeaways around growth mindset, is if we can help our students to develop these growth mindsets that make them lifelong learners, then we are not only giving them a tremendous gift, but we're helping the world too, right? Like, we want to put people out into the world who believe that they can learn and grow and change and make a difference. And so we want to help build these lifelong learners. And by teaching with a growth mindset, we are able to do that. And then finally, when we look at socioeconomic status and mindset, there's research that shows, so first of all, I want to qualify it to say that when we look at academic achievement, students from low SES groups historically do not perform at the same rate as students from high socioeconomic groups. And it's not because they're not as smart. It's a function of access, and it's a function of support, and a function of many other things. But what these series of studies found out, that when students from a low socioeconomic background are able to develop a growth mindset, they actually outperform students from high SES groups who have a lower growth mindset. And so this becomes an equalizer, right? And so by helping all of our students develop these growth mindsets, we enable them to be more successful and at all of the efforts that they put forth. So how do we do this? What are the instructional strategies for teaching with a growth mindset? One of the first things is teaching brain plasticity. Now, we haven't gone over neuroscience today, but one of the easiest ways to teach this is to help students understand a little bit about the brain and how the brain works, and how the neurons in our brains are constantly developing more and more neural connections. And so if you look at the neuron's this long skinny thing. It's got a cell body and then an axon, and then it has these little synapses that connect on the end. And so if you have an impoverished neuron, it means that it has limited number of synapses, the little things that come off of it. Maybe it looks like sort of a wild hairdo if we were to look at it in that kind of way. And so when you help students develop lots of synaptic connections, neural pathways, it tells us that we can continue to grow. Now, what this means is we can grow neural pathways. You can't say that your brain's growing, because if your brain's growing, it means you have a tumor. So we're not advocating that we want to grow the brain. We're growing neural connections. To think about this, since you've been out of college and you're not reading as much as maybe you did when you were in college. This is evidence to me, and like if I'm not constantly reading and keeping up with the literature, it makes me feel like I'm kind of dull. Like I don't have the connections. I can't help people that I'm serving connect all the research together. And so what that means is that if I'm not practicing it, all those neural pathways are sort of diminishing. This is the same thing with foreign languages. I have learned and forgotten Spanish twice. And the reason is because I don't practice it. I don't practice it in between the times when I live in Spanish-speaking countries. And it's because those neural pathways diminish. And so we have to do work to connect those neural pathways. Slow learning is essentially helping our students to break down tasks and make sure that they're able to work through really proximal kinds of things to get to the end task, and allowing them time and space to learn. The third instructional strategy, which is probably one of the biggest takeaways from this, is to have process-based praise. So instead of just praising for end results, really digging in to help the student understand where they succeeded in the process of trying to achieve something, and giving them feedback that supports that they worked through a process and how they improve that process to get the result that they want. A wise feedback is this. Wise feedback has two parts. This is from Carl Yeager out of UT Austin. And so the feedback sounds a little bit like this. I'm giving you this feedback because I have high expectations for you and I believe that you can meet them. The screen says something a little bit different, but it's the explicit invocation of high standards. I'm giving you this feedback because I have high expectations for you. And two, this personal assurance, and this has to be really honest and intentional, a belief that you can do this. And so this is connected back to the study that I presented around African American students. When we give these feedback to our students, any kind of student, regardless of their ethnic or racial identity, we help to build trust with them. And so it's a few more words, but if we can practice this and how we give feedback, it will serve our students. So again, this is what we call wise feedback. The next instructional strategy is creating classroom environments, creating a school culture that's safe for mistakes. And mistakes are how we learn, and mistakes are how we grow. You know, one of the things that was so challenging for me when I started off as an engineer at Texas Instruments is my job was to kill as many devices as possible. It was to make as many mistakes as I could and then study those mistakes to figure out how do we make sure that those mistakes don't always happen. And so I remember the cognitive dissonance that I had because that was not how I was trained. That was not how I was raised. I was raised to be perfect and to do everything right. But then here I was as a baby engineer trying to break everything, right? And this is it's not just in science and engineering. This is in so many places in our lives, is that when we have these mistakes, when we have these tiny, little failures along the way, they support us and our growth. And so we have the power and the control to influence the culture of our school, of our classroom, to make sure that we're creating environments that are safe for students to make these mistakes and learn from them. The next one is goals for growth. This one is really connected, I think, for the slow learning, but it's helping students to set really proximal goals. So instead of saying, hey, you've got this huge task over here, helping them break down and build that practice of dividing things up into really small things so that they can get to this, accomplish this, get to this, accomplish this. And we can help them develop those skill sets. The last one is my favorite one because it's the easiest one. It's the power of yet. So say that you or a student or whomever says, I can't do that. All you got to do is tack on the word yet. Okay, you can't do that yet. And that's a signal to them that tells them that they're going to be able to do that with some effort. And so this isn't about cheerleading and saying, hey, yeah, rah, rah, everybody's great. That's not what we're trying to say. We're trying to help them understand that with effort, they can succeed. And this is as much for our students as it is for us, right? If we can build growth mindsets, if we mimic and teach and emulate the kinds of things that we want our students to do, it's going to better serve them as well. One of the things that's been most useful to me in my adult life is this simple 5-word phrase. What else might be true? Now, the advice that when someone gave me this advice, it was because I had an immediate reaction to someone's action and made a lot of assumptions. And the feedback that she gave me is she said, what else might be true? And so how I practice this is if I find myself making an assumption about someone's action, I try to ask myself what else might be true. And with the 5 words, I try to come up with 5 reasons why this person might have the actions that they have. What else might be true, right? So let me give you an example. Last week, I was teaching an engineering camp to 85 6th grade girls. It was awesome and fun, and we did not have enough staff, and it was really challenging. We had this one student who was driving everyone nuts, to be quite honest. She was driving the teachers nuts. She was driving her group mates nuts. And we were having to be really careful in how we grouped our students so that no student would have to have prolonged time with her. And so after the first few days of this happening, I tried to ask myself, I was asking myself this the whole time, but I couldn't figure out how to respond to her. But I wanted to know, what else might be true that she's acting this way, right? That she is loud and she tears people down and she doesn't like their ideas. And so it was becoming such a problem, and she was like emotional. And so I was trying to practice this question. And so we're going to come back to the story as it threads throughout this content. What I want to introduce you to now is this idea of asset and deficit perspectives. So an asset perspective is where students' cultural differences or students' differences are perceived as beneficial to the learning environment, as opposed to a deficit perspective where their differences are perceived as detrimental to the learning environment, right? So asset means it's benefiting everyone. Deficit means it's detrimental, it's ruining everything kind of perspective. And so with the student, we were collectively having a very strong deficit. Like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with her? Like, she's just driving everyone nuts. Like, how do we, work around her, right? And so because I teach this, I had this aha moment of, maybe I can approach this differently. And so when we look at these two perspectives, this is when a student's home culture, or this is when a student's how they were raised, is different, dissimilar from the teacher or the school's culture. Okay. So an asset perspective is when we look at a student and you say, you bring a rich cultural knowledge to the classroom. We see what they are bringing to the classroom, their knowledge, their behaviors. We see them as resources. We look at their knowledge that they bring and the skills that they bring and figure out how to strategically use them in the classroom to bridge between home and school. And also it helps when an educator helps the student to make their own connections between the home and the school as well. Now, a deficit perspective is assumption that the student lacks knowledge, they lack behavior, they lack skills, they lack, insert any kind of word that you want to describe what we think of our students. They lack discipline, they lack work ethic, they lack whatever it is. It's this belief that these things that we're saying they lack, that what they are bringing is a hindrance. They're disruptive, they're lazy, they're whatever these things are. We see them as a hindrance to the classroom. The next point is that a cultural knowledge is not used to bridge that gap, and that ultimately what happens is when we approach students with a deficit perspective, we end up having lower expectations of students, and we take away our responsibility for their success. So I really want to highlight this. When we approach students with a deficit perspective, we unconsciously lower our expectations, or maybe consciously, and then we relinquish ourselves from the responsibility of that student being successful, because we say that student is, insert all of these explanations, and we don't see what we can do. So what I did with this student, and I will never know the long-term results of this because I only had her for a few days, right? What I ended up doing with the student is I pulled her aside and I wanted to tell her, I needed her to change her behavior, right? But instead of me just saying, you're driving everyone nuts, please be quiet, please be a team player, I wanted to say all these things. Instead, I approached it and I said, you know what? These skills that you're demonstrating really represent some great leadership skills. You are so good at expressing your opinion. You're so good at helping others to see a path forward. And so I was trying really hard to practice this and to pull out all these things and then switch the motivation for her to see, well, how do I be that leader? How do I be the person that helps bring my group together, rather than this sort of feeling of I'm tearing the whole group apart, right? And so what I was able to notice, and just by giving that little bit of feedback to her, is it changed the group dynamic in a really powerful way. She did cry first, but maybe that could be because she's in 6th grade. But I wanted her to see that she had really valuable skills to bring, and that we wanted to see them as an asset to that group rather than a deficit, right? So I want us to practice this for a little bit. Let me give you a scenario about Jorge. So Jorge So what we're going to do a few of these as time allows. I'm going to give you something that a teacher would say about Jorge. And then I want you to vote on whether you think that the teacher who's saying these words, I want you to vote if they have an asset or deficit perspective. And then I want you to think about and add to the chat box, what else might be true? What else might be going on with Jorge that makes him act in the way that we see? And then how can we look at his actions differently and see it as an asset to the classroom? So the teacher says, the poll's open and the chat's always open. Jorge is constantly disengaging during our competition challenges. Boys usually love to compete. He starts off strong, but then his participation fades as things heat up. I don't think he's learning the content because of this, which places him further behind and further behind. What can I do? So we see, it looks like most people are thinking that he has a deficit. The teacher has a deficit perspective. So what else might be true? And how do we take what this student brings to the classroom and approach it differently? So I'm going to give you a little bit of information. So what happens now is maybe you hear your colleagues say this, and because you're a team, you go and you observe this in the classroom, or maybe you've said this about a student and now you're going to go back and observe your classroom differently for this kind of student. So what you see is when you look at it differently, you look at the situation from a different lens, you see that Jorge is usually grouped with some very extroverted boys who act very cliquish. And it seems that he doesn't relate. So when you look at it from this perspective, there are some really specific things that we can do to see what Jorge brings to the room as an asset. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that not all students like or thrive off of competition. So everything doesn't need to be a competition, right? So what this is really tapping into are our values, right? So we live in the United States is a very individualistic culture, and there are many cultures that are collectivist cultures. And so that means that it's not about the competition, it's not about the individual, it's about what can we do as a team. And so what we could do here is, first of all, again, change how we teach so that if Jorge is from a collectivist culture where competition isn't the goal of everything you do. And by the way, if you were raised like I was in a very individualistic culture, everything is a competition, right? And that just seems the norm. And it is the norm if that's how you were raised and if you live in this country, because that's the normative behavior in the Western American culture. But there are many people in our country who live here who do not function in that way. And so we want to serve them. So again, thoughtfully create the groups where the students are able to relate and they feel like they belong. So let's look at the next scenario. This is a story about Dakota. So Dakota, this teacher believes Dakota is always talking. I tell her to stop and she persists. She even talks during quizzes and exams. I'm already docking her points. I just don't know what to do with her anymore. So go back to the poll and vote again and tell us, does she have an asset or deficit ideology perspective about the student? What else might be true? And how can we look at what the student brings as an asset rather than a deficit? How can we look at Dakota's actions differently and see them as an asset to the classroom? All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit more information on this scenario. So you are going to go back to the classroom and you're going to observe it differently. You notice that Dakota isn't just talking, she's actually helping other students. And this is a somewhat true story that I read in a book called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. It's a really fantastic book. I recommend reading it. It was really transformative for me. And she gives the story of working with a student who was always talking. But when she went back to look at what was actually happening, she noticed that Dakota was helping other students. And so Dakota is a Native American student and comes from a collectivist culture where helping is really important. And so the teacher then, what she does is she tries to thank Dakota for being so generous and helping others. and she allows her to help others when she feels a desire to do so. However, they make an agreement that the teacher will be really clear when that there are periods when we can't help others, right? And so again, we could look at a student. If you look at a student like an iceberg, right? We see a little bit that's above the surface, but then below the surface, there's so much that we don't know. And some of the comments that you're putting in the chat box really signal to that, right? Like, we don't know what's going on at home. It could be all kinds of things. But sometimes it's just a really simple thing around values, right? And it's how they want to help and contribute and how they want to learn. And so with really small, subtle adjustments, we can now, instead of penalizing Dakota for trying to help students, we can allow her to help other students, which benefits us, right? That's an asset to the classroom. We just make an agreement when we say, hey, this is a no helping time. We've got to focus on the test or whatever. All right, so one more. The next story is about Marisol. And again, this one is a true story about a woman that I was in grad school with. I'll reset the poll so you can vote whether you think it's asset or deficit. And so let's learn about Marisol. So the teacher may say, Marisol is so quiet. Her classmates get frustrated because she doesn't participate in group. I see that she's physically engaged and completes her tasks. She just doesn't talk to them. As a result, she consistently loses participation points, but that doesn't change her behavior. Funny thing is, she writes the most beautiful papers and essays. How can I get her to talk more in class? So asset deficit perspective, and then start adding thoughts to the chat box. What else might be true, and how can we look at the student's actions differently to see it as an asset to the classroom? So let me give you a little bit more information. So you go back and you look at this from a different lens. We learn that Marisol is an English learner, and she's a very hard worker. While she seems shy, she seems to enjoy group work. You see her on task, reading and writing throughout the class. So how do we change our classroom and how we engage with our students to see what Marisol brings as an asset? Because remember, she writes really beautiful, thoughtful papers and essays. How do we bring that into the classroom as an asset? So one thing that you can do is that you can try using a group process that rotates speaking opportunities so that students know when they'll be expected to participate so they can be ready. In addition, this is what my professor at Purdue did, is so instead of all of our participation grades being drawn from in class, she created a back channel where every student had to participate for points. So it was a blog or forum, something like that. And so that way, every student had their space to shine, and they were graded for that. And so for those of us who talked all the time, we sometimes could make a choice. Do we want to engage in this back channel? But we were going to be penalized if we didn't, right? So it honors what she brings to the class and encourages other people to learn from her in these same kinds of ways. This is also really great for students who are introverted or shy. And we can look at the values here and how they're different around the requirement that everyone speaks up at all times. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through Arun, and I want us to reflect on this. I want you to think about these questions and add some takeaways in the chat, and please discuss with your colleagues. What can we do to develop an appropriate lens for recognizing assets in students? And how will we practice using an asset perspective when dealing with those difficult, air quote, students? So spend a few minutes reflecting on this, and then we will wrap up our time together. I want you to keep thinking about these things. I'm going to give you the final questions, the final takeaways. So what I want to ask of you now is, how will you commit to having a growth and asset-based mindset for yourself, your colleagues, and your students? And I would love to know, what are your immediate action items? So how are you going to commit to having a growth and asset-based mindset for yourself, your colleagues, and your students? And what are your immediate action items? So some suggested action items are to, one, employ some of the instructional strategies for growth mindset. And so those strategies, if you will remember, I'll go back to that slide. Those strategies were teaching brain plasticity, teaching slow learning, process-based praise, giving our students wise feedback. And remember, wise feedback is this component where it has two components: an explicit invocation of high standards, a personal assurance that they will be able to improve with effort. Other strategies for growth mindset are creating environments and spaces and cultures that are safe for mistakes, helping students to develop those goals for growth, and then using the power of yet and how we give feedback. All right, so we've got a couple of examples. So Melanie adds that she wants to be more willing to embrace change, look for potential and encourage students. Steve says being open to trying new things and looking for good in people and situations, even when there appear to be none. JC says, listen to my colleagues and students so that I understand completely. You know, I really appreciate you saying that, JC, because so many of us are terrible listeners. Like, we think we're listening. We'll ask the questions with like the honest intent, but we forget to listen. And so that is a great skill to practice so that we can really listen to understand and so that we can better serve them. Morris adds that you want to try to see students for their unique abilities as opposed to trying to make them all the cookie cutter images of what a good student is. I love what you said there, Morris, because I might actually send this as like a follow-up activity for you all. Like, it's a great exercise to actually like draw an example of who is our perfect student. And then look at the fact that so many of our students don't actually fit that. And then realize how, if we're teaching to this perfect student, how we're not serving all these other students, and how these other students are further pushed to the margins because they don't meet our expectations of what we think that cookie cutter student is. So again, thanks for adding that, Morris. And you added at the end there, focusing on the strengths of students to give the students good feedback. Steve added practicing the idea of yet. Yes, it's one of my favorite. If you have kids, there's a great Sesame Street little music video with this. So if you just Google the power of yet Sesame Street, it should come up. I love it. I play it with the little people in my life, and I often play it for adults, and they also enjoy it. And so that's a great thing to watch as well. And then our last response is from Susan to offer different assignment options using the power of yet. Excellent. I want to thank all of you for your time today. I offer my sincerest apologies for the technical difficulties getting us started. I'm going to send some different little sort of nuggets of things that you all can continue to do to build on this work. If you never talk about it again, we failed. We've not made a good investment of our time. And so I hope that you continue to think about this. So I'm going to send you some resources that you can read and reflect on, some little snippets for maybe things that you can do in your meetings together to continue thinking about this. And I'm available if you have any questions, if you'd like to reach out to me and let me help you. So with that, again, thank you all so much for your time today, and I will be in touch with follow-up stuff through Steve, so he'll send that to you. And again, thank you all, and I'll stay on for a few minutes if you have any questions.